There's a huge amount of literature out there. There's a recent, very good report by the ILO. Janine Berg was one of the head writers that looks at the cloud work, not the on-demand kind of, so the work that's done remotely rather than done locally. So it's very good, and two big studies. So we're starting to see some empirical work. In the labor law literature, it is totally boring. It's, are they an employee or are they not an employee? Let's stick them in an intermediate category with some lesser rights. That's mostly the debate. Or, oh, let's forget about that and let's go to a universal basic income. It really is that kind of polarized. There's very little discussion of exactly what we need, and this is why this panel has been really, really helpful. How do we conceptualize it, and what kinds of methodological and intellectual tools do we need to deal with it? One of the things that I thought was really helpful from Eric's paper is that he's actually starting to think of how one conceptualizes platform work so you can see where value is extracted. So he's looking at the location of where the work is done. Is it dependent upon local labor markets? If it's embedded within local labor markets, the workers, then there's some way of strategically regulating and constituting that labor market in a way that's not deleterious, right? So we know that. For cloud work, it's a very different kind of thing. So where the work gets done is absolutely critical. Pricing models are absolutely critical because they show you where value, where the wage is being set, and that's critical. Every Marxist knows that, right? The wage relationship is absolutely critical and how that gets set. So that's completely. And the third thing that's really critical is who's the actual client. So if it is a personal service sector, it's really important to find out where value is being extracted in that context. And I think your argument that it's likely the platform, but the platform is in a tenuous position because it's like temporary employment agencies. Local actors can come in and eviscerate a local market because they have more local knowledge. So the large firms have to either go up the food chain or change. So the personal service markets, there's just a lack of study on that generally within industrial relations and labor studies, completely. And we know that consumers exercise discipline. God, we live in a tipping culture in Canada. It's offensive, right? But we live in that where we know that the largest proportion of someone's income who works in the retail, in the restaurant sector, comes from the client, right? So we just haven't looked at it because it tends to be girly, let's face it, that work, right? Or it tends to be visible minorities work. We can look at taxi, because taxis can do things like block up our roads. They have resistance. People don't usually leave the elderly patients that they're taking care of out in the street, right? So there's social norms. That's why the social norms is really important, because what economic sociology adds to a more traditional Marxist analysis where you're looking at value extraction and who can actually, who's extracting, is the social norms impact notions of desert and what kind of resistance behavior that we're going to take or not. So we don't mind taxi drivers shutting down our days, right? Our day's work. But we do mind it if, they're taking mom out into the cold, right? And we have these norms. So I think that the economic sociology is really important to bring status hierarchies and social norms back into a political economy analysis and start understanding that class is actually lives through these other social statuses that, right? So that's, I think, the place where I see economic sociology adding very significantly. That calls for a much broader analysis of how value is extracted from personal service work. Because we know that that's one of the largest growing parts of the population. People working in nail bars, people working, right, as domestic caregivers, all of that kind of stuff. With the other kind of platform work, there I think it's quite clear that it is the business client, right? And that then tells us how we need to regulate it. Because if all really the intermediaries are, so Amazon may be different because it was its own client first, and it may have the algorithmic control that it may be extracting rents and value, but we don't know that, right? And that's what we have to know. If there are some large platform players who are actually shaping the market in a much more profound way, because we do know that temporary employment agencies or intermediaries have gone in and shaped markets really rather than responding. So we need that kind of empirical work that charts what kind of market share these firms are having and how they price, which is really difficult because that will mostly be proprietary information, right? So that's where strategic litigation can be helpful, not in the fact of winning labor status, but actually disclosure, right? Disclosure agreements are really good for that kind of stuff, right? So I'd like to see more litigation for good disclosure, right? So I think economic sociology really fits around that kind of stuff. That then leads us into how we can deal with resistance, because we have to have those points of contact where we see where value matters. Because it's important, resistance is absolutely critical, it's a challenge, it's normative, but if it can't institutionalize, it can't shape the market, right? So that's really significant. But that's why we've got to know where value's being extracted and how this can be sustained, because someone must be making a profit from it somewhere or it wouldn't continue, right? So we need to know that kind of stuff. So then I think, okay, so political economy, tracing, if we look at pricing, location, and who's the client, we can start to follow the value. We can start typologizing or creating labor constitutions, right? Then we can start seeing where various forms of strategic action work, because I would think certain things like fair work and those kinds of soft laws would work if you have people not doing tasks but actual projects and they have the skills to withhold. That's not going to be a strategy you can use for taskers who are just, saying that this pricing in your Amazon catalog is incorrect. Okay, so you need to know these things to think about different kinds of resistance strategies. But then my question is around the economic sociology. I completely understand why one would move away from labor markets because of the normative notion that human beings are just human capital. But does contracting for work get you to the kinds of things that you need to think about? Because what is significant is that it's a labor market, so that supply is organized outside of the market, which leads to a contradiction essentially around demand. So can contracting for work get you to the point that actually labor markets get you to? Because can contracting for work deal with all the supply institutions that shape and that actually set a lot of the social norms and statuses? That's my concern, that for a normative point you're sacrificing some of the analytic power from the concept. Now, I like labor constitution because I really think it's important to get away from the notion that labor markets are simply regulated. God damn it, no, they're constituted. They don't exist and then get regulated. No, they're not out there, they're constructed. So I like labor constitution because it actually talks about how all these institutions are absolutely essential. They embody status hierarchies, all of these kinds of things. So I think that's really important. But I wondered then, I've always wondered this, so it's a constant puzzle, ideal typology methodology. Where will that get us? Because what an ideal typology methodology, it's very helpful. I like typologies. I wonder what's the difference between that and a taxonomy. Those are the things that plague me, right? But typology doesn't get drivers. It doesn't get the dynamic. So one of the things that an old style, Eric and I are kind of old style on this, an old style, more classical Marxist political economy, is that I'm looking for my driver. I'm always looking for value capture, right? So I know what I'm looking for. So that's kind of the question I have around this.